Yeah, we'll just kind of go from there.
Grand. So, good evening, Steelers. If you can hear me, let me know in the chat. A couple of people are already mentioned, chatting away there straight away. So, thanks for joining us tonight. Tonight is quite interesting for me in particular because we're talking to Ivan Sorensen from Nordic Weasel Games, who some of you, I'm sure, are aware of. I was playing one of Ivan's games just a couple of weeks ago live, something I need to get back to at some point. So I'm quite excited to talk to him about this, and I have no. Ivan was the one that came up with the idea of talking about the First World War in Wargaming, so it's all down to him really this tonight. And but I leapt on it. I thought it was a good idea really. So we've got Ivan over here. Whereabouts are you in the US, Ivan?
Hey, man. So I am currently in Michigan up in the north. So I actually grew up in Denmark, but at this point I've lived half a life in Denmark and half a life in the States.
Right, brilliant. So, okay, so how old were you when you left Denmark?
21, something like that.
Okay, so quite an age then, I guess.
So yeah,
big difference. Well, what we do, we'll get straight into it. I mean, what we're going to do, really, a rough order of business tonight. And as we both said, we're not really sure how long this is going to go on for. It'll be as long as it is. I'm just going to get some info out of Ivan. I want to know about game design and things, and because obviously he's quite a prolific game designer. Keith Mount has said, "Does Ivan actually exist? Has anyone ever seen him?" I don't think he does, Keith. I think I've found one photograph of him somewhere online. So yeah, I'd like to talk to you about about your game design, how you approach it, that kind of thing. And we've got some questions here that we can work our way through, and then we're also going to talk a little bit about the First World War and wargaming.
Yeah, I think kind of a mutual passion of ours.
Absolutely, yeah. I was going to say, actually, we're almost brothers from a different mother, you and I. I mean, we both love metal, we both love cats, we both love the First World War, we both love wargaming.
Yeah,
there's parallel lives, isn't it?
I know, right?
It's kind of crazy. So we've got quite a few people in already, so I'm not going to say hello to everybody, but thanks for everybody for joining tonight. This is the first live chat I've done for a little while, but won't be the last one.
Yeah,
so first of all,
I'll apologize in advance if right now the cats are sleeping, but if they're suddenly meowing in the background, we'll just kind of roll with it.
Yeah, they'll want feeding, I'm sure, at some point, won't they? Mine have already been fed because it's 7 o'clock here, so they'll be quiet for the night, I think. So tell us a little bit about yourself then, Ivan, just to give us some background really on your gaming. Where did you start? How did you start in it? You said you're Danish. That must be an interesting, and from my point of view, very different gaming scene in Denmark than say even in the US or the UK.
Yeah, definitely is. So I was born in the 80s. So my kind of like coming of age and getting into gaming is kind of more like late 80s, kind of early 90s.
Okay.
Whereas, in historical gaming especially, there's a tendency for, it's a bit of an older crowd generally. You get a lot of people who are, who started gaming in the 70s. And that was all like come and gone. And I think like a lot of kids, like my starting point was basically like, Games Workshop and Warhammer. Warhammer 40,000 second edition was really like what opened this idea of, like playing toy soldiers and rolling dice and having stuff happen, right?
Yeah.
And then it just kind of like spiraled out from there. Like, it was always odd to us because, we had like a little circle of kids that all played games, and we were always just into like games. It wasn't specifically miniatures or specifically RPGs. Like we wanted to play anything we could get our hands on.
Okay.
So, the same kids who had Warhammer guys got Magic cards and played board games, and we got, our first copy of Axis and Allies, and like we just wanted to play everything we could get our hands on.
Yeah, of course.
Historical gaming really comes down to like one thing. This was the same thing that kind of like started my interest in history, which was finding, it kind of ties into the World War I topic, because in Denmark at least, we don't really teach like the First World War. Like it's just kind of gets passed by because it's not really like a big part of Danish history.
Yeah.
So in the school library, I had found a translated copy of All Quiet on the Western Front. And I grabbed it and sat and read it. And it was one of those moments that I think a lot of people have at some point where you realize that history isn't just about like things and places and times and dates. It's about people who lived and breathed and, died. And that, like I don't know how old I was at the time, 10, 11, like that's a big realization. Like, oh, these people that existed these times, like they were just like, you and me.
Mm-hmm.
And that kind of got me down on the path and really like cemented like my love for especially the First World War, my fascination with it. So when we started like gaming, I immediately, like once we had access to the internet, mid 90s, went online and tried to find, historical games to play. It was like, oh, that must be something out there like this, like Warhammer, all this stuff, but for these things. I think the first historical game I ever actually played was a free game. I think the website is called the War Times Journal, a free game called 1916.
Okay.
And at the time, like finding World War I miniatures was basically like not happening. So we like cut out pieces of cardboard and wrote like infantry on each like square. Or, you were lucky if you could get like a box of like, like Revell or Airfix figures or something like that.
Yeah.
So it was very like improvised and kind of rough. But that was like the start of it for historical gaming. Then once like the internet came and it was possible, to like purchase stuff online and so on, then like the floodgates opened. But I think it was a lot different from like, especially like in the UK where it seems like miniatures games is just more of an ingrained kind of thing. Because I remember like I would find like lists of games online and I would go down to the local gaming store and they would look at it as like, yeah, our distributor don't carry any of it. So you just, if you're a kid without a credit card, you just couldn't access all of that stuff. Like it might as well not have existed. So, but yeah, so that was kind of like the starting point on it. And then like from there, like I said, once I had access to be able to get games from like around the world, then I wanted all of it. I wanted to make up for lost time, right?
Of course. I suppose you felt a bit cut off then, didn't you? If you weren't able to actually get any games in or anything.
Yeah, it was one of these. I mean, in a way, maybe it encouraged us to be more creative and like try to come up with our own stuff.
Yeah.
But it was always this feeling of like this big world that existed out there that we just, like it was just difficult to access. You knew like the one guy who got like games in from the UK or from the US or.
And everybody was his friend.
Yeah, like you had to track down this stuff, and if the game kind of sucked, well, we don't got another book, so we're just gonna play it anyway. It's not like today where you can go online and find like 100 different systems for like World War II skirmish or something.
Yeah. I mean, we're absolutely swamped, aren't we, these days with rules? It's great, it's a completely different world to what it was then, and I think it should be for the better. Absolutely. Oh
yeah, I think it's definitely like a golden age right now. You can get miniatures from like anywhere in the world. You can get rules from anywhere, terrain, like. So yeah, it's definitely like we're better off than at that time.
Yeah, for sure. So. Nowadays, then, I mean, that's kind of your starting wargaming. What do you play now predominantly? What holds your interest more than anything else?
So other than just copping out and saying everything, because I'm really bad about just finding things fascinating. Long-term sci-fi gamer. I like sci-fi skirmish stuff. That's what kind of has my heart. The World Wars, World War I, World War II, an increasing interest in like 19th century stuff, especially kind of like I've seen some people call it the age of rifles, which I don't know if that's caught on, but I really like that term. Sort of like 1860 up through like pre-machine gun, basically.
Yeah.
Which is a really like fascinating era. So that's kind of
it's real developments, isn't it? That point. Where the tactics are completely changing in European armies in particular, from the big musket armed blocks of soldiers to individual soldiers, isn't it?
Yeah, and almost like from each Yeah, and almost like from each conflict to the next, like something changes, like you go from like 1866 and, the Prussians and the Austrians, and one side is using, rifled muskets. And then 4 years later, they're fighting the French, and now both sides have like breech loading rifles,
Yeah.
Like the jumps are so quick, like move forward 10 years or something, and you have like the Lebel rifles showing up, and like everything changes again.
Yeah, it's crazy because you think about the muskets, they were in use for probably about 200 years almost, weren't they?
Yeah, something like that. And then suddenly, like,
yeah. But then one thing, you're going from one to the next, aren't you? Literally within decades, aren't you? Really, it's crazy. Yeah. The pace of it is an interesting period. It's not something I know a particularly great deal about, historically or wargaming wise, but yeah, it is. What little I know about it is quite interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So, and what kind of scales and things do you play in? Are you a 28 man or a 15 mil man?
No, 15 millimeter. Although lately, so recently, or a little over a year ago, we had to move kind of unexpectedly, and I ended up kind of taking the opportunity to get rid of a bunch of stuff and then rebuilding. Because I'm really bad about. I think a lot of people can identify with this. You see something cool, you buy 2 units worth of it. And then it sits on your shelf because you can't play anything with 2 units worth of whatever, Bavarian Grenadiers or something. So you end up with technically like armies worth of miniatures, but none of it goes together. So being able to start over a little bit. So right now I'm doing 172 plastics for World War I. But usually 15 millimeter is my like home scale. That's sort of, for me at least, like the best balance between size and affordability and being able to like fit it on a human sized like dinner table.
Yeah, as I'm sure you know, I mean, I'm pretty much rooted in 15 mil. I've got bits and pieces of other stuff, but I try to be as focused as I can on one particular scale, just because it makes life a lot easier, doesn't it? Really, you can swap terrain about and things, and all these kind of things fall into place when you're just using, instead of bits and pieces of different scales. It's difficult to do much with, I find anyway. I mean,
yeah, like terrain is really the killer. Like hills or trees you can kind of use with anything because they're out of scale anyway. But as soon as you get like buildings or stuff like that, so you either have to like collect it in multiple scales or like sticking fairly closely to one scale does make an awful lot of sense. Definitely like from a collecting and building perspective, if you want to. And it is also like, it speeds up the amount of time you can get to, instead of having 2 half finished tables and like, 10 millimeter and 28 or whatever.
You can have several in 15 millimeter.
Right,
I mean, I'll go as far as even using to make my terrain as useful as possible. I'll go as far as making 2 millimeter terrain fit to my 15 mil stuff. So trees and things become scrub, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and a lot of that stuff is out of scale anyway, so it's you can use it pretty widely. Like I have no shame of. I don't even look at the scale when I'm buying like model trees. It's
a tree's a tree, isn't it? It could be any size at any time, couldn't it? Really?
Yeah, exactly. Absolutely.
Yeah. And then the other big question I really wanted to talk to you about was game design, really, and your background in game design, because you are very prolific when it comes to putting out war games.
Yeah, a little bit.
And that's one thing I definitely know about you. I don't have all of your systems. I actually bought 5 Men in Curse today.
Okay, thank you.
Vault. I've been reading it this afternoon in between work, and I recognise bits and pieces of it from 5 Men in Normandy, which I already had a copy of. And I've also got a PDF copy of 5 Parsecs as well. And again, I probably couldn't even tell you how many other rule sets you've got out there. So my first challenge is, can you?
I'd have to look at the list because it gets pretty long. You can narrow it down a little bit by like families, because some of them are obviously like related. So, the 5-core stuff, 5 Men at Kursk, the 5-core skirmish rules and that stuff, that all connects together. A lot of it is, you get an idea for something or an engine, if you will. Like Trenchhammer came out of that, where it was originally a sci-fi game, Squad Hammer. And then it's like, okay, well, I bet this engine could do this. So let's try pushing in this direction. So you get all these little offshoots. Then after a while, like, and I'm not trying to bag on anyone, but I always get a little bored when writers just keep doing the same thing in the same engine, like over and over. At some point, it starts feeling like you're just kind of like filling in the blanks a little bit.
Yeah.
Like it becomes a wargaming, like paint by numbers or something. So at some point, I just get bored and I want to do like a new engine. I want to create a new thing, and then something else comes out of it. Like, you know, some things gets carried over. You know, there's a lot of common elements to it. Like most of what I write is playable with like pretty modest like model counts. So that's a big something I try to kind of emphasize.
Yeah.
You know, there's a tendency towards a skirmish level because that's just what I find the most interesting.
Yeah. I suppose half of it has to be what you find interesting as much as anything else, doesn't it? Because otherwise, there's no point writing them, really.
Yeah, it has to be a concept that I'm interested in at the time, and it has to be something that I find, you know, like huge battle games don't tend to really catch me. And it's funny because a lot of times people have the opposite view. The skirmish gaming tends to kind of get ignored a little bit because people are like, oh, well, it's just a skirmish. It doesn't really matter. Like they want to play like all of, you know, Waterloo or whatever. And I always kind of had it the opposite way, that the huge battles, I don't find that interesting. For me, it's more the man-to-man level. Like that's the part that's always been intrigued me, like how individual men like react under combat, or how. And once you kind of zoom in on those, you know, you get more of like a story to things. You can, you know, start piecing together like how things work.
Yeah, it's adding that narrative to the game, isn't it? As much as anything else. I mean, you know, I like big battles, but I also I never thought I liked skirmish games until relatively recently, when I got into Chain of Command, and that's the thing that really turned my head towards skirmish gaming, and just the narrative. And I see a lot of, you know, I like the Too Fat Lardy stuff because of their narrative in the games, and you know, like the characters and things. And from the few games that I've played of yours, I see the same thing in there as well. You know, so that really appeals to me, I think. And I don't know how much their stuff has ever influenced you, or...
So I played a fair amount. I played an okay amount of Chain of Command. I played a lot of what was the previous one? Troops, Weapons, and Tactics.
Oh yeah.
Which actually, in some ways, like better, even though the card system can be a little like, I understand why they went back and kind of redid it, but it was still a pretty good game. So I'm familiar. They weren't a huge influence necessarily. The biggest influence, honestly, like from a design perspective, would have been Nuts from 2 Hour War Games.
Yeah, I've heard a lot of good things about Nuts. I've never played it, but yeah, everybody praises it. It's one of those games, isn't it?
Yeah, we played it a lot for a long time, and like the sort of structure of like a small unit with a campaign element and like your characters acquiring skills and stuff like that kind of became the norm for 5 Minute Normandy. That all came like straight out of Nuts. The mechanics are totally different. But that sort of idea, because that was something that a lot of sci-fi games and fantasy games had done, you know, some of the old Games Workshop stuff, but it was a lot harder to find for historical games. That's something I really wanted, was this idea that you get to follow, you know, like a couple of characters along, because it creates that investment of, it's not just like third squad I'm sending out to like get killed. It's these dudes who last game, they were the ones to hold off the attack, and this is my favorite character, and I don't know if I want him to go fight a Panther tank on his own, you know.
No, I get that. I mean, adding a name or just a tiny bit of personality to a tiny 15mm figure just completely changes your perception of the game completely, doesn't it?
Right. Suddenly it's like, when we were teenagers, we used to have a thing where you had to pick out a dude in your army that was your character, and it had to be just a regular grunt in some squad somewhere, and then at the end of the game we would give like a few extra points if your dude survived. You know, just little things like that, just adding more. It's basically like adding investment, right? You know?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like I say, going back to that narrative, really, it's not so much about the winning or the losing of the game. It's the the story that goes through the game, isn't it? That is as equally enjoyable, I find.
Absolutely,
that's the thing. I think definitely about it. So you are a full-time game designer, aren't you? I mean, that's your job. And how long have you done that for? And how easy did you find it to go from not being a game designer to being a full-time game designer? What was the thing that changed? How did you realize that you could actually get paid for doing this?
Yeah, with a lot of risk taking. So at the time, I had always like experimented with just tinkering with games, tinkering with little things that I put together, and I would play with my friends, and like most teenager projects, they didn't go anywhere.
Yeah.
So the two moments where it really kind of changed, one was a set of sci-fi rules called Fast and Dirty, which was supposed to be a bit of a pun, and I guess it sounds like one, which were ended up actually becoming sort of popular. They got, back in the days when like Yahoo groups were a thing, there was a bit of a community for it. It was one of those moments where you realize, it was just a free thing I had created. But the realization that there were like strangers out there who thought this was cool and wanted to play it and wanted to see more, that was kind of a big like, oh shit, and then shortly before I moved to the States, I had started tinkering with actually a World War One game called Trench Storm, although it's not available any longer. And a small American, they were the U.S. distributor for IT miniatures. I think they did like 20 millimeter stuff.
Okay.
They were looking for a rule set to kind of like glue onto that and kind of help promote them. So they had picked it up from me, and it never like really moved anywhere. I suspect no more than like 200 copies were ever sold. At least I got paid for 200 copies. I don't know what got sold, but they're not around anymore. So it's just, but that was kind of like I can create something that people will like find interesting, and more importantly, like creating this stuff is fun. So fast forward like several years, and I was working at a really terrible job that I usually call the hell office. It was just corporate middle management for a crappy company that was doing outsourcing for another even worse company. It's just, and it was just, it was getting worse and worse. And I was like, and finally you're like, okay, I've got to get out of here. I calculated out, like, if I can I set a goal, and the goal was stupid. It was basically like, if I could sell stuff worth $300 a month, that wouldn't, pay the bills, but that would be the proof of concept. If I could do that, like over a couple of months, then that would show that, okay, you can do this. And then from there, it just kind of became history, I guess. The big thing really, and I think a lot of people who try to set out with this with the goal of making money, because you don't have to. You can publish for any reason, You just want to have your name on something, or you just want to say you did it, right?
Yeah.
But I think for people who want to make it into a business that can sustain itself, you have to write a lot, basically. And not, you don't have to like churn stuff out. You don't want to churn out garbage. But you have to, like, I see a lot of people will write like one game and then they kind of sit back, and that's not going to go anywhere, because what's going to happen is people will read that game and then they'll be like, oh, I wonder if this guy did anything else,
Yeah.
Or they see it like, oh, I bet like this guy would be really good for like a naval game or something, So by creating more things and having a back catalog, that's what helps you like actually turn it into something resembling a living. Like it was a long time going. Like, miniatures gaming is a niche, and independent miniatures gaming is a very small sliver of that niche. So you have to kind of like carve out like your little corner of it. You have to carve out like an audience who's receptive to what you're doing and who likes the tone and what you have.
Well, I certainly think that you've certainly got lots of fans.
They do. They crawl out under rocks. Yeah.
Well, as long as they're crawling out and spending money on your stuff, it doesn't matter where they're coming from, does it?
Oh, absolutely.
But yeah, I mean, they people do rate your stuff very highly, and again, the few games that I've seen of yours, as I say, reading through the 5 parsecs, it's a fantastic it's a great read. I mean, I'm not particularly interested in skirmish gaming, but I really like the concept of it. I know we're probably not going to touch too much on 5 parsecs because of
it's been well covered elsewhere right now as well.
And Andrew just said that he says he's been a fan since Fast and Dirty. So there you go. There's one of your old fans as well.
Thumbs up.
And I mean, I find the whole world building behind your stuff is really good as well. And again, that just goes back to that narrative of games. The fact that you put so much effort into even just the generation tables that you do for the Second World War. For the different skills and things that the figures can have with the D100s, isn't it, on most of them? So
they're usually D100s.
So the scores of choices that you can get out of each table and things.
I think a lot of it that's an area where a lot of like the RPG background maybe also like shines through a little bit, because you can take a lot of those ideas and those concepts. But I've always believed, and I think a lot of games does random tables in a way that's kind of boring. Because it's not interesting to just have a list of like stuff that you roll on. It has to actually like connect to something, It has to be something that makes you think about like the character or the scenario or the thing that you're doing. Like a lot of times, this is maybe a little tangential, but like you see a lot of times for like Dungeons and Dragons stuff, people make a table of like D100 like doors in a cave. Like that's not interesting. Like who cares what the door looks like? Like what's interesting is what happens around it. Like does this like create a scenario or does it create an image of something? Like I think all the way back to like 5 Minute Normandy, there's been like a random event of like 2 of your characters getting into a fight. And it's just a stupid little thing, but it's something. Like if you're sitting and watching a movie or a show, right? These characters in like stressful circumstances, and it may not make a huge difference, but it's basic, like pushing the story along. Like, okay, like these 2 guys hate each other. Maybe I don't like deploy them next to each other. Not because the rules say I can't, but that's just like that's how it develops.
That's the sensible thing to do, isn't it? And
like this
as a platoon leader or a corporal, that's what you'd do. You'd make sure that the 2 guys that don't like each other aren't next to each other in the
right. So it has to create something that's interesting or add something that's interesting.
So it can be sustainable as an income then. I mean, to go back to you,
it can,
full time.
You have to be a little lucky. You have to be prolific, and I think it helps if you are like I said before, you have a tone that. Like something that makes people associated with you. Like I think, there's a certain style to what I do. It's not necessarily overly formal. It tends to be more story oriented. It tends to be playable on a smaller budget. And once you kind of have that, like there's an audience, obviously. There was an audience who were really into that. There was like we recently did a set of medieval rules, Knight, Pike, and Sword, and one of the things was I kept looking for medieval skirmish games and then being told that for a skirmish you need like 200 guys. Like that's mental. I'm not going to pay 200 dudes just to play like a little like cattle raid or something, like I just bought a game that'll go unnamed, and which was a skirmish, and one of the scenarios has like hundreds of figures on each side and requires a table that was 12 feet wide. I was like, that is not happening. My living room isn't that big. So, you have to sort of like carve out like a niche of something that people are interested in and they want. And I think I lucked out a little bit too, because at the time, the whole warband kind of game style of like, following like a small group of characters over multiple games, that wasn't like as big as it is now. Like now it seems like everywhere you turn, something new like that is coming out.
I mean, it's at the moment, isn't it? It's very much what people can afford, isn't it?
There's a lot of that, and I think like gaming space is also a thing.
Huge thing, isn't it? I mean, a lot of games nowadays are 3x4 or 4x4 boards, aren't they? They're really shrinking.
Yeah, for sure. Like, and like I've played on a lot of people's like dinner tables, and like the biggest tables over here tends to be like 3x5. And then if you want to have like a little room for your drink and so the cat doesn't swipe your grenadiers off the table or whatever. So yeah, I think there's a lot of that. I think also a lot of old school game rules were really written for like the club environment where you get together in the gaming club and you would have, like a huge table and huge armies that were meant for for lots of players.
Mm.
But I think increasingly there's a lot of people who are like, yeah, I know, like I live in a town with like one dude who plays miniatures games. So a game that requires a huge army and a massive table, that's not going to work. But a game where we can build a platoon each and play, like I think that's why part of why Chain of Command blew up so much. That it was something that was you could buy, like $50 or equivalent old world money will get you like something resembling an army, right? You need a platoon of guys, like a Sherman tank, a mortar, and like a couple extra dudes.
Yeah.
And I can buy that. I can paint that in like a week, and I can play a game, and it doesn't feel like I'm playing I have to make do. Like I'm playing the real game. That's that's the level it's meant to be played at. And I think a lot of people were kind of like ready for that, like as opposed to having to paint up like 1,000 trucks or whatever, because because the rule book includes all of like the supply and support units that nobody wants to play on the table.
Yeah, of course. Just got a question here from the audience in a tutorium. So it's question 5. And what would you define the in-between size of games as? Because there's skirmish games and mass battle games. What about the in-between of 20 to 50 men per side? I mean, I'd say that they are relatively skirmishy, I would have thought.
Yeah, I think I'm going to cheat and call it mass skirmish because I think that's kind of, but it's right. Like there's kind of like a gap. Because like a lot of times when people say skirmish, I think like games where each figure can move and fight individually to an extent.
Yeah.
But in something like Chain of Command, that's not quite the case. Like you're moving around teams and squads or sections. Yeah. So yeah, I think like mass skirmish, or that's a term I would go with. I
think I'd agree, to be honest. Yeah, I mean, it's a bit of a grey area, isn't it?
Well, it's one of those things, like, you can get any number of, like, fat dudes with beards, and I say that as a fat dude with a beard, to argue forever about the definition of a skirmish game, Yeah,
absolutely. And it's usually just one figure either side of the limit, isn't it? It's either 10 figures or 11 figures.
Right. Like,
figures,
by the time you have 12, it's just too many. I can't do this.
I'd say, it's mass skirmish now. Big battle stuff.
I think I'm comfortable with the idea of mass skirmish for games where you have individual figures and they are semi-independent, like they shoot individual. That's usually the case. Yeah. But they act as some sort of units, like a lot of platoon level games for like historicals are like that.
Yeah, because I when I read 5 Men in Normandy, I mean, I realized it was, it's obviously a level below Chain of Command. So it's a completely different type of game, isn't it? Because you're concentrating more on those individual characters, and it's almost like like you said, you mentioned it before. It's almost like a cross between miniature historical wargaming and role playing. Really, it's a bit of a blurred line between the two, without it being too much of one or too much of the other, I guess, which is really nice and fits in really well with other wargaming, I think. So when you are writing a new game, when you decide to, you think, right, I want, where do you get the ideas from in the first place? I mean, what would inspire you to sit down and go, right, okay, I'm going to tackle this subject now? What is it? Something you've read? Is it TV, movies, books?
So there's a couple of possible sources that have produced games. Sometimes it's literally just a mechanic that I get into my head. I think, oh, that would be cool. Like for 5 Men in Normandy, it was not originally meant specifically as a World War II game. The original idea, just to use that as an example, was I wanted something that had a one-roll combat. Like you roll the dice once, and that tells you everything you need. Did I hit somebody? Did I kill somebody? Did somebody run away?
Yeah.
Instead of having I roll to hit, I roll to see if he's dead, I roll for morale, I see how bad he, that whole like chain. And the second was this idea I had, because at the time, everyone was starting to talk about friction in games, right? Like orders don't get carried out correctly. But I always end up feeling a little dissatisfied with systems like that, because I would play games where, like, you could just bomb out completely and you don't get to do anything. or you get to move one guy and the other side gets to move their entire army.
Mm-hmm.
And I always found that both like really just unsatisfactory just as a player, but also that it was probably going a little too far. Like soldiers left on their own will figure something to do with themselves. They may not do what you wanted them to do, but you know, if something is happening. So the concept in mind was that you should always be able to do something that you need to have happen, but you should never be able to do everything you need.
Yeah.
And that's where the like turn sequence die came from. And like Kursk uses the same thing, just on a you know, as a dice pool instead. But that was really like the two like mechanical ideas. And then from there, it's like, okay, this is starting to look a lot like this would fit a World War II thing. And, you know, at the time I had been rewatching like Band of Brothers for the 200th time or whatever. So sometimes it's a mechanical concept that I just like, oh, this mechanic feels like you could hang a game on it. Let's develop that more. Sometimes it's something I'm interested in. I did a couple of like 19th century black powder things just because I was really interested in the period at the time and reading about it. Once or twice, I will admit, it has been out of spite. That's a terrible thing to admit. My Cold War game, No End in Sight, came about because people kept telling me, like, you can't do a game where, like, the hit chances are low because it would be boring. You can't do a game we have to recover casualties. You can't do a game where, like, your troops degrade in combat. And I was like, no, you totally can, and I'm going to show you. Or, you know, stuff like that. Like, you know, I have a little bit of ego. I did a retro clone of the original Warhammer 40,000 Rogue Trader, which became Renegade Scout, because I kept seeing online people saying, like, oh, okay, you know, like, we would love to do this and getting groups together. And like any internet group project, it goes away. Like, you know, because it turns out that churning out like a 200-page rule book is a lot of work, let alone agreeing with 4 other people on it. So I did that just to show that it totally could be done if I was one doing it. So that's me polishing my feather a little bit.
Polish your way. That's what you're here for.
But most of the time, it's either a mechanical concept or just something I like have a passion for, or something that I've been wanting to do for a while. You know. There is a lot of inspiration from like books, obviously, but also like movies, occasionally video games, more on the sci-fi side. Like video games were a big element in like the 5 parsecs iteration, and occasionally even stuff like music and other things. You know, like when I'm writing on something, I will put together like a playlist that fits the project, which is why it occasionally like shows up in the books as well. Like some of the books will have a playlist in them to.
I was going to say one of the things I did like about 5 parsecs is the list at the back, which is just your influences. You know, everything, and then you can see it shining through. You know, if you know what those particular things are, it's great to see that. Just the effort in putting that in, I thought was excellent. It's almost like designer notes, isn't it? At the back, you know, this is what I was thinking about while I was doing this game. Yeah, it's great. Yeah,
it's something that I always want to see when I buy a game. Like I read the designer notes first, pretty much. Like one of my favorite games, almost as much just for the explanations, is the old Command Decision, because what was it, Frank Chadwick always had extensive designer notes with why he did things, why things were the way they were. And the same, with influences and stuff. And I also think, like I said before, like historical gaming is dominated by a lot of people who kind of came of age as gamers well before I did. So there's a different influences. You grew up at a different time. Gaming was different. Culture was different. So I feel like sometimes I also have to like wave the flag a little for like the 80s and 90s kids. You know, like, hey, we were here too. We just had totally different stuff. Somebody was mentioning bolt throw in the chat.
I could notice on the
which is a long-term favorite of mine.
Blood for the Blood God.
Absolutely.
that was the flexi disc that came out with Games Workshop, wasn't it, back in the late 80s, early 90s?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, especially like out of that, like, gritty sci-fi culture that was so like steeped in like, you know, death metal bands and new wave of British heavy metal stuff. And
absolutely, yeah. Yeah, brilliant. So you basically you're taking influences from wherever, I guess, aren't you? It's just where they come, and
it's this kind of a soup of random stuff. It all kind of like melts together.
Balsogoth. I know Balsogoth. I used to know them anyway.
Mhm.
From Sheffield. Yeah. So then, when you are developing games, I mean, how do you try to make it as different from previous? Because obviously, I mean, you're known for various 5 core games. So, how do you make it different enough from the last one, or do you even try? I mean, because that's what you're known for.
Right. So it depends a little because it's kind of tricky, right? Because if somebody picks up a game and sees, oh, this is based on 5 core, like they pick up 5 core, like Company Command. They're going to want it to be like pretty similar because that's the whole point of picking up, a game based on the same system. But at the same time, you don't want it to be like, oh, okay, like this is literally just the same thing, but like strike out soldier and put squad instead,
Yeah.
At that point, you're just taking people's money. A big part of what I try to do, and I absolutely wholeheartedly believe in this, is that whenever I'm writing on something, I will absolutely not read or play games in that specific genre. So if I'm writing on a World War II project, I will stay away from any World War II miniatures games.
Okay.
I'll watch movies, I'll listen to music, I'll read, history books and stuff, but I'll avoid rules, including my own, as much as possible. Just shut it all out. Because every time if I don't do that, like humans are always prone to, we'll see things, we'll kind of internalize them. Like, oh, okay. So you'll get an idea, but it's not really like the idea you would have come up with otherwise. You saw it somewhere and it's kind of like percolated through.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean it's bad to be like inspired by stuff, like that happens all the time. And I can point to specific cases where I deliberately took stuff from other games. But I think you want to like have that kind of happen more naturally. So I think like creating a bit of distance to it helps. And then focusing on like what is specific to this project. Like when we did 5-core Company Command, which is just scaling up the system, basically. Like the soldiers become squads and blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
One of the things was like, okay, what would be different then? Well, a squad is a bunch of dudes and they could have, so there's, I forget what it's called in the rules, like specialists. So you can have like a sniper like attached to a squad. You can have a medical guy attached in a way that wouldn't, because in the skirmish rules, those would be, specific other characters.
Yeah.
So that was a way of sort of scaling it up a little bit. And also thinking about like, well, what does that do to like ground distances? Not that I'm big for like very meticulous like ground distances, but things like a squad is a different entity than a single soldier, but a tank is still a single tank. So you have to piece together how those are going to like relate to each other, right?
Yeah. Okay.
So
that's going to be one of my other questions. Then, do you play other people's games?
Oh yes, absolutely. But like I said, not. I will avoid whatever I'm like working on. Yeah. But yeah, I've played the game that really like stands out the most to me is the Venerable Crossfire, actually, which is still, even though the vehicle stuff is not that great, but I'm not super interested in vehicle combat anyway. But as far as like infantry combat and like initiative and so on, Crossfire is one of those games that I think like everyone should have read and played at some point. It leaves that kind of impression.
Yeah, I've played a version of it. My friend, he likes it a lot, and we've not played the Second World War version of it, but he's changed it for his own purposes for basically for a near future modern stroke sci-fi.
Nice
game. So we've, I know the mechanics of it. As I say, not as written, but I know how he's changed it around. And obviously, it's not, he's not publishing it; he's just doing it for himself.
Oh, absolutely!
So he's just taking those mechanics because he likes them. And yeah, it is a very interesting game. I like the initiative where if you do something wrong, you lose the initiative. So it makes you a lot more cautious about what you're actually doing.
Yeah, it can be really uncomfortable to play because a lot of times, like, there's no good options. You have to move forward to secure this flank, but that means getting shot. You have to get these guys rallied back in the fight, but they're going to fail the check. You have to pin down this enemy, but you don't have the firepower to do it reliably. So yeah, some of my favorite wargame experience has been Battles of Crossfire, where we both had really crappy armies with poor commanders. And it just becomes this like miserable slog of like trying to herd like one more squad of Hungarians or whatever, like back in the line so you can hold before. That may sound weird, but it really has that like high risk, like tense feeling to it, where every move feels like it's important.
Yeah. Well, leading up from that, I guess I was going to go back to really the again game design and your 5 core mechanics, which are kind of your, I suppose they're your signature, aren't they? Really,
in a way, yeah.
For sure. I mean, there's so many games that are attached to those. And how did the development for those come about in the first place? And also how much have you tweaked them over the years? I know you were saying before that people will expect a certain set things within the 5 core mechanics, but surely, I mean, the 5 men in Normandy can't be similar to 5 parsecs, or is it?
Yeah. So the connecting thread, I think, really is the campaign aspects and the structure of that, more so than like a specific game mechanic. Because I think that's really like what people keyed into. This idea of like you have your characters, you follow, things happen, you will engage in battles each turn, things will happen as a consequence, you'll have to contend with, your best dude is wounded and he's going to have to like sit in the hospital for a while or whatever.
Yeah.
So I think that's like the golden thread that links all of it together. The original 5 parsecs shared the same game mechanics as 5 Men in Normandy and the 5 core skirmish rules. They ended up changing a bit over the years because I felt that it needed something that was a little more concrete and a little faster to play because the campaign structure was getting more complicated.
Yeah.
And at the time, originally, it wasn't really intended as a solo game. It ended up working out really well that way, but that was just intended as like one way of playing it. It was always meant to be a head-to-head game. But that's not like the audience that kind of like keyed into it. Like the people who really gravitated towards it were solo gamers. So that's been like more and more emphasized over time and how things work in a solo context.
Yeah.
And I think for solo gaming, one of the things that, for me at least, like really discourages me is if I'm playing a game on my own and I realize I screwed something up and it was 2 turns ago and that dude should be alive and this thing shouldn't have happened. And I always tell people just move on and like ignore it, like just go on. But it really frustrates me when it happens. And when you're playing a game with a friend, they're gonna call out like, "Oh wait, you forgot to roll for the thing."
Yeah.
So I think for solo-oriented games, things need to be a little simpler than they normally would be because one player has to handle all of it and has to be able to keep all of it in their head. So that's one of the things that has changed over the time is just a greater emphasis on like simplicity. And of course, you get people who want more complexity to it and they want more grid in the machine, and so you have to find ways of giving that to them as well or giving it to them somewhere else. But I also think because the mechanics were always meant to be kind of bolted together, like each element of the rules were supposed to be kind of standalone, which makes them very robust to like pull things out and put other things in. So you could keep the turn sequence from 5 Men in Normandy and pull in like a completely standard like roll to hit, roll to kill system if you wanted, if you didn't like the combat system. And the game will still work. It'll feel maybe a little less cohesive, but it'll function that way. And that was a big part of it too, that it was meant to be kind of bolt together. Like one of the original goals in the very small crowdfunding it did when I was creating it originally was that you could play it as a skirmish game without the campaign rules, or you could take the campaign rules and use your own skirmish rules, or you could use it together or whatever. Like it was all meant to be sort of bite-sized, and you could piece it together any way you wanted.
Yeah. I mean, I can see that and see how that works. And like you say, you don't have to use your particular combat rules. The campaign rules would work easily with pretty much any other game.
Yeah, exactly. Now, it turned out that's not actually what people wanted. They just wanted a complete package. So you end up going back and saying, okay, so like for Kursk, 5 Men in Kursk, which is much more like a chromed out, there's a lot more stuff in there, right? So that was written while it still has some of that just from its ancestry. That was written as more of a cohesive, like, here's the game. You play it this way. You start on page here. You roll up your squad. You go to war. You roll up a scenario. You go through it, right? So just from that's the audience that was kind of like gravitating towards. They wanted, more chrome. They wanted more detail. They wanted. I remember everyone was mad that there's really no stats in 5 Minute Normandy. And that was one of the things, because I had at the time, and I'm perfectly willing to admit I'm wrong, but my belief at the time was that if you zoom in on the individual soldier level, a lot of like doctrine difference and questions stop really mattering that much. It's more a question of like, will this guy shoot back, or is he going to hit the dirt? Is he,
Yeah, I guess at that point they're all trained to do a particular thing, aren't they? It's tactically, I think, when you get down to squad level, they're supposed to be doing the best thing that they're doing anyway, which is fight the enemy, isn't it? The hiding behind a wall isn't different in the Hungarian army,
right?
In the US army, is it? They're still going to do the same thing, aren't they? So
that was kind of my view on it at the time, and there was also a lot of like we've all played, especially like Napoleonic games are really bad about this, where it's like, here's the rules for everyone. At +1 if you're playing the French, at +2 if you're playing the British. And I'm not disagreeing with whether those ratings are good or bad in like the context of a battle game. Obviously, doctrine matters. Some armies are better trained, but the more you zoom in, it becomes this weird thing of like, well, the French guys are obviously better, and that starts feeling kind of like weird to me. So I wanted to basically avoid that, but then everyone wanted some sort of ratings, because we like having little numbers for our dudes, so we can argue about whether the Russians should be a +2 or +3 by late 1941 if blah blah blah. So Kursk got like squad ratings. We're like, okay, your squad is rated based on something that felt appropriate for and even then it's a little hokey, because like once you start putting numbers on it, you're basically just quantifying like game terms, like how do you make the Soviets play a little different from the Germans without it being like a fantasy game, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's like you said, that's kind of going back to Warhammer kind of stuff, isn't it? With a stat line.
Absolutely, and
but even there in Warhammer, they know that all humans are a same stat, aren't they?
Right. Like there you got to be an alien with like multiple limbs in order to get a +1. So
exactly. But you also do things as well. I mean, we'll start to move on to the First World War stuff, I think. Because I want to talk a little bit about Trench Hammer as well, and where did the idea for creating a First World War game come from?
So part of it was that I had always like I said, like World War One was like, that is my entry point into like military history and stuff. So that had always kind of like been there, and been something I wanted to do and I wanted to go back to. And after doing, and it was a funny like connecting point, because Squad Hammer was meant as like a grab whatever miniatures you have and have like a stupid battle. Like the cover of the original book has a KV-2 tank fighting like a T-Rex or a Triceratops. Like it was meant to just be like a silly game. And then when we tested it and started playing it, and people start playing it and like writing back to me, they were basically like, it turned out to work really well tactically, like almost on accident. Like things like combined arms works really well, like different units supporting each other in a way that is actually kind of coincidental. But because like morale and damage and stuff just gets mushed together into one damage value, it ends up like working really well. Like it's more clever than it feels more clever than it is.
Yeah.
In a way. And the guy who was the co-writer on the project had written to me and was like, hey, I think this would work really well for like 1916 on like trench fighting. Especially when you have like the late war, like British and the American organization, we have like the really specialized platoons. They can all become like, you have your rifle platoon, you have your rifle grenadiers, your bombing squad or section. So that was kind of like the origin of it. Then after that, it was just a question of kind of like bashing it out. I'm trying to remember the order they happened in, because I did it for the Winter War as well, and I did one for the Russian Revolution, each of which had slight changes to the formula and different things I wanted to try out to kind of fit. But yeah, it was essentially just a mix of like having a game engine that inadvertently ended up like working really well for it. And then just like the long term, like it was something I knew I wanted to go back to doing again.
Right. Yeah, because I mean, I've played it, and I've not played it for a few years now, so I can't really remember the rules. But what I can remember about it is that it felt very tactical. It was, the idea of the squads were mutually supporting one another, and if you used period tactics, you would achieve your goals. I felt it's a game that I want to go back to because, like I said, I've just not had a chance to play it for a few years, and I just remember the games that we played. Me and my mate, we played it. We really enjoyed it. It's a great little set of rules, I think. What was the reception to it then?
It was generally pretty well
covered, is it?
Yeah, it was generally pretty well received. It ended up kind of being its own beast a little bit. I didn't see very many comparisons to, like I think you were saying, Through the Mud and the Blood is obviously like the big dog as far as like low level, like World War One. But I don't know if it's because it's squad based, but a very small number of squads, which is not usually the thing. Like usually, like most World War One games, like go a step up. Either you get like just complete man to man like trench raiding, or you go up to like over the top or spearhead or. Where you have like platoon or company stance. So being squad based and aimed at, like you're really only supposed to play with like 8 or 9 squads on each side. Like it's a pretty intimate affair. And I think that made it stand out quite a bit. But I think it's also a game, like I said, it kind of, because it reads very plainly, like there's not much in there really. Like you roll for how many orders you get. You can move your different squads around, you roll to hit, and you can kind of make up the target number. And then you roll for damage and mark off hit points. Like that's really all there kind of is. But it ends up, like I said, working really well for like squads supporting each other. You want to engage the enemy in a firefight. You can wear them down. So when you close assault them, they've already taken damage, and your bombing squad can knock them out. Or, so yeah, I think it's a game that like sneaks up on people a little bit because it's easy to read through and say, oh, okay, this is obviously like a beer and pretzels game, and it is, but it's like a clever beer and pretzels game, I guess.
There's certainly enough in it to make you think while you're playing it, I think, definitely.
Yeah, and without like overtaxing, because I think it's easy for to also become like over obsessed with like minutia, like like at the end of the day, like how much does it matter whether the squad has a Lewis gun or a Shoshaw or a BAR? It probably doesn't matter like all of that much, right?
When you're getting shots at by them, there's still a gun firing at you.
right. So
yeah, but so then it's quite different then, really, isn't it, to the 5-core stuff?
It's
like the 5 men in Normandy, and basically it's a completely different set of rules, isn't it? Really, why the change there? Why what made you do it differently?
Honestly, at the time, it was just kind of overdue for doing a new game engine for something. And I wanted I was really keen on the idea of a game that had 2 qualities to it. One, I wanted to see if you could do away with morale. Because in a lot of games, like everyone agrees morale is important, but I've always kind of felt that the way morale tends to work in tabletop games and the way it works when you read like an account of a battle don't often feel like they connect up. Like you're not going to get like, dudes like climbing out of the trenches and running away like in plain sight of like a Maxim gun, outside of like very specific circumstances. So I wanted to do something else where morale was just kind of part of the combat system, in which the answer became like just folded into damage.
Yeah.
The idea is that if you shoot at a unit, they're going to degrade in some way. You might have killed a dude. You might have missed, but they're now heads down. And either way, they're more vulnerable to what happens around them. You might have wounded a guy. Now they're busy like dealing with that. So when they rally, maybe they've gotten over like, okay, we lost a dude, but we're good to go again. Maybe they just clear up their heads. They bandage up the guy. They've eaten their lunches, whatever.
Off the room.
Right, like get a little liquid courage. And the other thing was I wanted a game where it literally didn't matter like how you did your units. If you want to grab 6 individual figures and just line them up, in a skirmish formation. That's it. Fine. If you want to use a troop stand, like, Flames of War bases or something.
Yeah.
That's fine, because it's just what matters is the unit, not the individual. Like how they're organized or arranged. Again, to kind of like lower the barrier of entry a little bit. Just make it as easy as possible for people to get started and get into it. So, if you want to build a platoon and you want to take 6 guys for each of your squads, you need 4 of them. You can do that pretty easily. If you want to just grab some, you have some old figures you base for like Over the Top or Great War Spearhead, and just grab those and you can use them right away.
Yeah. Well, I used square bashing figures for mine, and mine they were based 4 to a square, I think 30 by 30 millimeter squares, and yeah, they worked perfectly well. There was no need to do anything else. Just basically, 2 bases, and away we went. Really, it worked, like I say, perfectly well. Really for my. Yeah, it's a great little game. But do you think you'd ever do a 5-core First World War game?
I've wanted to for a while. It's one of those things where it's tricky because, as we're about to talk about, World War One is a very niche, like wargaming.
You made a fail, by the way. Print camera has just been purchased.
Oh, well, thanks, man.
A fellow Nordic chap.
Well, World War One is always interesting for Nordic people because it didn't concern us at all, right? So we got to watch on as everyone else did all the gassing and machine gunning. But yeah, I've wanted to go back to it again, and particularly something has that man-to-man kind of vibe. But it's one of those things where you have to just figure out like how to do it well, because you almost have to like break it up into multiple games because it's so different, right? Like when you read about like the fighting, if you take the British like at Mons and Le Cateau and stuff, that's a whole different experience. And even like a few months later when they're slugging out on the Iron or whatever. So I will tell you about the Holy Grail I have. I have a couple of Holy Grails, but this is one of them that I want to do someday. Which have particular fascination, along with the First World Wars, the Russian Revolution, the Russian Civil War especially. And there was, of course, the Allied intervention that happened in the Russian Civil War. Part of that, there was a small number of American troops, not a huge amount, but there was an expedition that was sent to Murmansk and Archangel up in the north. Eventually under British command, under Ironside, I think. But they were there for a while, the 339th Regiment, and they're notable because a lot of them were from Michigan, where I live now. And they were there over the winter. They engaged in combat. They had, kind of interesting stories. It's just one little regiment in this conflict that they knew nothing about on the other side of the world. They thought they were going to go fight the Germans, and now they're here. And I've wanted to do a project for that for a while because there's a lot of documentation that's available for it. And do a campaign game where you would follow them from their arrival, in like October of 1918, I think they arrived, and all the way through the withdrawal. And you have to keep them alive through the winter, have to deal with the different objectives and stuff. Yeah. And then flesh it out a little bit to be kind of a gamer's guide to like the conflict, because as I think we're going to talk about in a moment, like World War One can be a bit of a beast to like get a handle on, especially from a gaming perspective. It's easy to find a general history of the war. It's a lot harder to find stuff that's going to tell you the stuff that gamers are going to want to know. So that's kind of my holy grail that I would love to do. Is a combined sort of campaign game and like a little bit of an amateur history guide to that. But that would be a lot of work for the like 17 sales they would get because it's so obscure.
Well, I'd be one of them.
So I appreciate it. I'll hold you to that.
Me and 16 others, I think.
Yeah, we'll get it up there. We'll get a Kickstarter for like $48 to get some cover art.
But then, yeah, I mean that's probably going to bring us into really like the second part of this discussion, which you said you were wanting to do anyway, and this is about how the First World War really fits into wargaming, I suppose. And as I said, this is something I wanted to do a bit of a wargamers guide video at some point in the First World War, and I mean it's a massive subject anyway, as you've already touched on. Just in itself. And there are several rules out there already that cover stuff, including obviously trench hammer being one of them. For those low-level things and mud and blood and that kind of stuff. There's a few others, I think. I'm trying to remember the name of them. You've mentioned Over the Top, which I didn't know existed, to be honest.
Okay, yeah, it's been out of print for years. It's basically a command decision, but for World War One.
Right.
Yeah. And there's a few others. Price of Glory, I think, is based on Disposable Heroes, and there's Great War Spearhead. Like, there's a smattering out there. I think the real issue is, and I think you were the one who was tweeting about this earlier, the sort of like pop culture perception of the First World War, that really hurts people's prospect of like gaming it and being involved with it because I think for a lot of people, even for people who are otherwise into history, it's viewed as, like pointless charges. You line all your dudes up, you move them forward 4 inches at a time while the other player rolls to kill them. And then they blow the whistle and they get to do the same thing. But that's not really, like that's one of the things, even when I was a kid and reading into it, where, we didn't have that much of that pop culture. Like I didn't watch Blackadder until like years later. But even then it was a bit of a realization, like, oh, there was a lot really going on, right?
Absolutely. I mean, yeah, it's funny. It's funny we were talking about it because somebody literally just a few days ago on one of the Facebook groups, in a couple of Facebook groups, I mean, they'd said pretty much verbatim what you've just said there. That it's impossible to play because I think somebody was saying, what was it? I think it might have been a chain of command. Somebody was a chain of command group. Somebody was talking about they were saying that the British Army in 1918 was more apt to retreat than the French Army in 1916 at Verdun, and it's like, well, you're actually comparing apples and oranges there. The two situations of Verdun, fighting at Verdun, and the fighting in the spring offensives of 1918 are so completely different.
Right.
For so many different reasons and contexts and backgrounds that the two of them don't match, and also. You just got to look. In August of 1918, the British Army were attacking and pushing everything forward in front of them.
Right.
It's just one of those, but with the French Army in 1916 were defending what was a symbol of France at the time. So there was no wonder they weren't retreating.
Right.
And it's just you like I said, there's this. That's like saying to a Second World War gamer the difference between the British Army in 1940 at Dunkirk and the British Army in 1944 in Normandy.
Right.
The two are totally different.
Well, and there's a lot of, like hard lessons that had to be acquired, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Like I just finished reading Sheffield's Forgotten Victory, which I know you had mentioned online, which really digs into that without the offensives from the Somme and without the groundwork laid there. Like these things had to be learned. You can't retrain, an army of millions outside of combat.
It's an incredible feat of arms to go from a citizen army of nothing to an army that 9 million men passed through in 4 years. Right. Win a war against a major German European army that relied on the reserves and the men having national service, which there wasn't in the UK, in Britain.
Right.
So it's a massive feat of arms, military revolution.
Right. But that's kind of the problem, right? Because it's hard to sometimes get that impression. Because if you're getting out and you say, okay, I want to start gaming World War One, you go online, you find some miniatures, and you can find some dudes who are, you go buy Peter Pig or whatever you buy for your figures, and like, okay, I need to know something about this. And you go pick out a book, like, you pick up. Like I think Keegan has like a general history of the war. You can pick Max Hastings' Catastrophe, or there's plenty of these like general histories, and they will tell you that on this day, Third Corps did this and this, and you can read that and you'll understand how the war went, but you're really not any closer to being able to like put your dudes on the table and move them around.
Yeah.
And historical wargame rules, and we're all guilty of this, have a bad habit of assuming that you already know everything you need to know before you sit down and play. Like, I went through a few years ago.
To be fair, though, I think I'll jump in on a defence on that. I mean, it's pretty difficult to write a full history of the Second World War in a
right.
You know, I know what you're saying, but yeah, I can understand why they don't do it. But yeah.
Oh yeah, and if you do, people will get mad and yell at you because you got something wrong, right?
Yeah, exactly.
But that's the thing. That's why I think, like, like Two Fat Lordies in the back of the Troops, Weapons, and Tactics, they had a little section. I think Through the Mud and the Blood has it too, where they explain, like, here's actually how, like, platoon tactics worked. You know, and yeah, like, that eats up a good chunk of page count. But that really, like, you could sit down and read through that and be like, oh my God, I understand how it works now. I understand how these units are supposed to relate to each other. And I think that's what makes it so difficult. And, because otherwise you got to go find, like, pretty specialized literature. And even then can be a bit of a crapshoot, Like, when I started getting into Napoleonic gaming, people on forums were like, okay, yeah, like, here's a bunch of books in French and German you need. Like, that doesn't help me. I speak 2 languages poorly. Neither of them are French or German. But that's really, like, so I guess where I'll turn it to you a little bit. Like, what was your starting point, like, to understand World War I in a gameable context?
Well, this kind of goes back. I mean, my interest in history had always really been the Second World War throughout my teenage years, and I think this is probably similar to a lot of people as well. It seems like the bigger war, and also, people probably of my age and slightly older, you kind of get that the war films on TV and that kind of stuff. And I, when I studied the First World War, we did it at school, and it was literally the time when Blackadder had been released. Blackadder Rose Forth, and it was like that. So we were basically watching Blackadder at night, getting our heads filled with nonsense.
Oh, right.
And then, translating that into our schoolwork, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And Blackadder's a comedy program. It's not a history.
Yeah.
It's a satire, but it's deeply rooted in the 1960s histories of the war. And I mean, I could talk about this for hours, but I won't do just now. But yeah, my interest really kind of came about. I knew about the war from doing it in school, but it kind of came about from really working in France as an archaeologist. I got a chance to go and do some First World War archaeology back in 2003, and suddenly realized that, yeah, this is actually an interesting war. And I've been doing that ever since. Pretty much every year I've been in France or Belgium digging trenches, and so from that I kind of just wanted to know more about it, really. And the more I started reading about it, I was just starting to read any general books I could find. And like you say, most of them were high-level stuff, like the John Keegan First World War and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But a lot of it was because they were so easy to get hold of. A lot of them are what we would call, I suppose, duff history.
Right.
They're poorly written. They're not badly researched, but just, they're relying on old tropes of the 1960s and the donkeys and
right. Like regurgitating the same. You can have the access to the sources, but if you're sort of like setting out to make the same conclusion.
Yes, absolutely, that's it. But then I went and I actually studied. The book that turned my brain around about the First World War was Trench Warfare, 1914 to 1918, by, I think it's Tony Ashcroft. If there's somebody listening, Google it and have a look. I'm sure it's Tony Ashcroft. And what was interesting in that was his description of what was called the live and let live system of fighting, where basically the two sides, to stop escalation of artillery duels, they basically just didn't fire at each other, or they didn't fire at each other at particular times of the day, and that
right. You would fire like a specific foxhole that was known to be empty, or
exactly, because all it would do is just bring down fire on the enemy. You know what I mean? They fire back, and it just become this massive artillery duel with the poor bloody infantry in the middle of it. So it was kind of and then also he talked a lot about how battalions were rotated out of the line. Before that, I was very much very much of the old school 1960s school of First World War, where it was all futile. It was, a massive tragedy. It was, billions of people were killed. And even stuff like that. I mean, people say, they think that the casualties in the First World War are much higher than they actually were. I think it's 16 million. I think were killed in total in the First World War, including civilians. The Second World War, the Soviets alone took 22 million casualties.
Right.
You know what I mean? It's like you almost double from just one country. But we don't see the Second World War in that same sense of futility or tragedy.
Right. I think that's also a piece that tends to get missed, and this happens a lot in Anglo media, where there is still the idea that nothing came of it and yada yada. But I was tweeting about this earlier today. If you're Czech or Polish or Serb or any of these people, quite a lot came out of it. You can argue, we can argue along about the cost and so on. And I think that's really helpful. But things happen. If you're Belgian, you got your country back. Those are all.
Well, I mean, the Belgian population was shipped off to armament factories in Germany to work as slave laborers. They were shooting civilians left, right, and centre. The burning of Leuven library, things like that. There's all kinds of atrocities carried out across Belgium, and we just forget about that. I mean,
which is funny because the trope of poor little Belgium, that was literally one of the war justifications. But I think that's also an element of modern cynicism that creeps into it.
But the thing with the poor little Belgium is, I mean, that part of it is very much propaganda at the time. But for Britain, since Elizabethan times, from a national security point of view, it's always needed the Low Countries, Holland and Belgium, to be neutral. Right. And that's why we signed the Treaty of London in the 1830s, to ensure that those countries were neutral, because, as Napoleon said, they're a dagger staring at the heart of England.
Right.
And they always have been. We've gone to war with pretty much everybody in Europe over Belgium and Holland for the last 400 years. The First World War was no different. And also, I mean, Germany, we're using it as the Kaisers was using it as a reason to grab more lands. But same as what Hitler was doing in the Second World War with his Lebensraum. It's a very similar model that they were following, just without the mass genocide that the Nazis caused, against Jews and Poles and Gypsies and everybody under the sun that wasn't German and Aryan, or what they thought was German and Aryan. Anyway.
I was going to say, plenty of Germans who also got the got in the way of that. But I think that's part of why it's it also gets dismissed, because there's not really World War II has the very obvious, we're all ingrained in World War II culture, right? And especially, post Saving Private Ryan and Band of Brothers, and people started getting that interest in Grandpa had stories, and it's hard to find, even over here, it's hard to find people who weren't in some way affected. Everyone had somebody who was somewhere in the Air Force or somewhere in the Army, or they worked in a munitions factory. But for World War I, we recently had the 100-year anniversary. Those people are all gone. It's stories of people who aren't with us anymore. It was interesting to see. I don't know if you followed the Great War YouTube project.
I've seen them, but I've not really followed it so much. I'm aware of it, though.
Yeah, I mean, it'll take 4 years to watch the whole thing, because the whole thing was, doing week by week, 100 years later, but it was interesting to see it kind of come back in the public mind in a way that it really hadn't been. For a long time, World War I, outside of the UK, I wager, was kind of the forgotten war. In the States, certainly, it was just more so than Korea, for example. So it's interesting to see the anniversary kind of bring it back, and there was an offshot of you got with movies and TV and other stuff, 1917 came out not too long ago. There was another one where it really came back into the public mind in a way it hadn't been in a long time.
Yeah, It's yeah. Just to say, my change, my thinking on the First World War had changed massively through the book I mentioned, Tony Ashcroft. But then I went on and did the master's degree in First World War studies at Birmingham under Gary Sheffield and Spencer Jones, who was jumping in on the machine gun thread the other day.
Yeah.
So these are the premier First World War scholars in the UK at the moment. And they are very much anti-donkeys nonsense.
Right. Which I guess is like people throw around the term revisionist history. Like that's become a snarl word, but it really is like revising. It's going back to the same material and looking at it anew.
Oh yeah, completely. It is. I mean, that's what they call themselves. Is a revisionist historian, and they very much are looking at the source material with fresh eyes, without the probably political connotations that there were in the 60s.
You have the
because what's interesting, just to bring this round, is until you mentioned it earlier, All Quiet on the Western Front, until that was published, I think in 1930. The First World War was actually seen, in the British point of view anyway, was seen very much as the Great Crusade, and the it was a heroic undertaking for Britain. I mean, horrific casualties, of course, but from a point of view, the country were behind the war. There's very, very few dissenting voices. It's really until people like Wilfred Owen start to get published in anthologies again in the late 20s, early 30s, that the whole perception of the war shifts. You mentioned books. One really, really good one here is Dan Todman's The Great War, Myth and Memory. Goes through, it's not a history book of the war, it's a history book of the history of the war. So he goes through the different decades and how they perceived the war and how that changed, because of societal issues and because of different histories and things and different publishing and stuff. And it's a really interesting read. It's probably my favorite book actually on the First World War. But as I say, it's not a military history; it's a social history. Right. And it's a social history of perception as well. Not even of it at the time. It's well worth getting, and it's a good read as well. There's some quite funny bits in it here and there. It's quite dry sense of humor.
Sure. But I wonder also if it's one of those things where maybe we needed more distance in order to kind of go back and reassess things. Once the various, because like everything is going to be, we're always going to interpret things based on our own society, our own culture. So if you're looking at it, in the 60s or 70s at the height of anti-Vietnam movements and things like that, people are going to come away with a different conclusion, and you kind of need that.
There's I think it's the Myth of the Great War by Mosby. That was written at the height of the or just after the Vietnam War, and that's more of a book about the Vietnam War than the First World War.
Yeah, it's very much a polemic. I make a point of reading his books because they're interesting, but he's definitely a bit of a he definitely comes with some interesting conclusions.
Take it with a pinch of salt. I mean, I think one of his conclusions, if I'm remembering correctly, was that there were more British and French killed because their cemeteries are bigger in France.
He has a really weird point about, like, if you looked at the cemeteries, you would think the Germans won or something.
Yeah, it's because there's less German dead. No, it's just there's more Germans in those smaller areas. France didn't like a load of dead Germans in France.
Right.
But yeah, it's the whole perception of the war is something I'm quite interested in. Just the way that people see it. And as I say, I mean, just even the other day I was arguing about somebody was saying, what were they saying? They were saying that the German stormtrooper tactics were way better than the British ones in 1980. Nobody had small unit tactics apart from the Germans, who had the stormtroopers. It's like, well, no, the British had developed tactics in 1916. That were completely
Right,
in 1914 that were like the stormtrooper tactics. But instead of taking the best men from the rest of the army and making the rest of the army worse, they taught it to everybody.
Right.
So all the British soldiers were like stormtroopers, really. I mean, they lacked training in some cases because they were busy building roads and things, but they had access to training pamphlets. Whereas
that's one of the things that kind of stood out to me as well when I started digging into it more, was how specialized, like even down to like the infantry platoon. Because we're used to, from World War II onwards, a platoon is 3 or 4 squads that are all identical. They're all outfitted the same way. All got Lee Enfields, each got a Bren gun. They all got the same lunch boxes. But like the late war, like British platoon, and as far as I know, the French developed similar things, but I'm not super well read on them. You have this like really specialized formation. You have your rifle section, you have your bombing section, you have your machine gun section, you have a rifle grenade section, and it's something that you really only get at that like point in time, like late World War One. Like going into the war, it's just like 40 dudes with rifles.
Yeah.
And coming out of it, eventually it'll go to what we recognize in World War II of being this uniform organization. But for that like short moment of like a couple of years and like these specific circumstances, you have this really like specialized formation, which if the idea of like there are no like low level tactics or whatever, you can't look at that and say, okay, well, obviously they had no idea, they just crawled out of the trenches and played soccer on the way to the machine guns. If they are being organized in this way,
Yeah. Well, again, even that stuff, I mean, like the walking towards German machine guns, I mean, that's a fallacy anyway. If you dig a little bit even into the first day of the Somme, I mean, the Irish 36 Irish division, they crawled out into no man's land. Waited to the barrage to lift and then ran at the German trenches.
Right.
That's not the popular perception of British soldiers walking in lines into machine gun fire, is it? But that's what people think happens. But the actual fact is that something else completely differently happened. And it's the same with. I mean, the tactics developed because of it was an arms race between the attack and defensive tactics. The German defensive tactics completely changed, from massed frontline trenches to rear slope trenches and strong points, and then to shell craters being joined up rather than actual trench lines.
Right.
Oh, that is a massive, again, development. And on top of that, you've not only got that, you've got the artillery developments as well that are moving as well. 1914, they're firing not over open sights, but only from what the forward observer can see.
Yeah, I mean, often over open sights and like some like confused fighting, and then really complex. You get the creeping barrages and box barrages, and I remember being pretty young and reading the square bashing rules, and there are like 8 different kinds of barrage list. And it's like, wow, I didn't even know what a box barrage is or whatever. Like it's way more complicated or way more involved, way more complex than you kind of.
But I mean, even that, the scientific changes in artillery fire from the Somme onwards, again, it's a massive difference. So the fact that they're using sound ranging to locate German batteries, flash spotting, they've got the wirelesses in the aeroplanes, so they're able to land hits on targets a lot.
Right, like the
bombardments, all kinds of stuff is
like the birth of counter battery fire, really.
Absolutely.
Which previously had not been like much of a thing historically, because there was just no way of doing it effectively.
No, and the thing, and this is why a lot of the later war assaults work really well, because they basically silence the German guns before they even jump off from the trenches. Already the German counterfire can't come in because it doesn't exist anymore.
Right.
And again, this is something that is missed out in a lot of games, I would think, and again in a lot of people's ideas of war. Just that technological and scientific advance that is incredible over those 4 years. The revolution in military affairs, and the I think one of the things that people do point to is the tanks, but the tanks really were very secondary in in overall victory because they were so rubbish. Basically.
Yeah, it's hardly blitzkrieg, but it's one of those things like one, wargamers like their toys.
Yeah.
And two, like World War I tanks look cool.
Oh yeah.
So when you get those together, you have to come up with an excuse of getting them on the table.
Absolutely, yeah. It's always the Villas Bretonneux tank versus tank fight, isn't it? The only one time it ever happened in the war.
Right. So it happens
like that. But even then the tanks they were just mobile pillboxes. They weren't. They weren't seen as they were 20 years later when they were rushing across France. It's a completely different set of tactical situations that they were being used in. Again, really, but they certainly weren't war with us. Even by 1918, they were so unreliable that their range was so short that even if they did start and get off the jumping off point, they weren't on the battlefield for very long anyway.
Well, right. If you make it to the enemy trench,
yeah, you're doing really well.
Right. So it's one of those things. One thing that because like I alluded to earlier, the first sort of commercial thing I did was a World War I game, Trench Storm, and I remember talking to somebody, and they asked the question of like, well, how can you make a game about trench warfare? I mean, nothing happens, nobody wins. And one of the things that stood out to me was when you read about offensives, even failed ones, even ones that failed dramatically, the initial assault was almost always successful. Not in the sense of winning a strategic success, but in the sense that they got into the enemy trench line, they captured the bunker, they broke into the enemy trench system. The failure is almost always until the very end, the inability to exploit the difference between breaking in and breaking out, right?
Yeah.
But when we're talking about a gaming perspective and we're not gaming out the entirety of the Somme.
No.
We're gaming out, the third Fusilier or whatever, and their attack. And it's a funny thing because we often complain that historical war games are way too bloody. The casualty rates are insanely high on the tabletop because we want dudes to die when we shoot at them, right? But for World War I and a trench assault, it almost ends up like fitting okay because we kind of want fairly high, like even successful assaults were often costly. And the initial assault, like it doesn't matter on our gaming table whether your dudes are going to be swept away in the inevitable counterattack. Like what matters is that you have to capture the front trench line or the second line, or you have to cut their wire or whatever. And that is very achievable without doing anything in like an unrealistic sense. Does that make sense? Like you don't have to change up a lot. Like a lot of times you'll see like Over the Top did this where explain like, oh, we didn't really like put a lot of trench scenarios in the book because it's more fun to focus on like Palestine and so on, but I don't think you have to do that. You can absolutely do like trench to trench scenarios and have them be playable and gameable because the victory conditions that we're used to in tabletop scenarios are already kind of skewed. Like in a lot of I played a lot of World War II games where if that was an actual command and that's how many losses I had taking a hill, I would have been executed. Especially playing Red Army units, throwing away the People's T-34s or whatever. Yeah. But that kind of works to our advantage because that's a lot of cases is how a assault on like the front lines worked. They got in, they broke into the line, and then they had to hang on while the reinforcements are brought up. And guess what? There is another regiment of angry Germans like one trench over, and they're ready to go.
Yeah.
So I think in a lot of ways, some of the things that we tend to view as difficulties of World War I gaming, in a way, I think they are not misconceptions, but they're just things we maybe don't even need to worry about. like tank vulnerability is another one where, like, historically, like, tanks had a pretty rough time of it, right? Like, you're inside of a field gun, you're probably dead, but our tanks on the gaming table don't tend to last that much longer either. Yeah. It's pretty rare that there's that many of them rolling around in the end when you're done playing the game. So in a way, it almost, just by the inaccuracy, the things that are normally inaccurate in tabletop gaming actually kind of works to our advantage, I think, for World War I gaming.
Just thinking about it, I mean, trench warfare is an aspect of the Second World War as well. Especially on the Eastern Front, and you don't really see many wargamers decrying that and saying, I can't fight Kursk because the Russians were dug in. Nothing happens. You know what I mean? It's all right.
Right.
Like things, which is slightly different, but they've also got.
Well, sure, but
Russians deal with tanks. Which are
right.
Also,
and how much mobility do you have when your tanks are stuck in a minefield somewhere?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's a similar problem. It's just you just have to think about it a little bit more. But yeah, I mean, that's one of the things that people do say about the First World War in wargaming that I've noticed is how can you play when it's just trenches lined up against each other. So somebody's mentioned in the chat there, they were talking about British attacking a trench with machine guns across an open field. Now, just running across that open field knows you're going to die. But that's the tactics they were using were supporting fire to get across that field.
Right.
Losing the rifle grenades, that kind of thing. It's just about using the tactics of the time, because, as you say, they did get into the frontline trenches.
Yeah, more often than not. Even relatively bad troops. I mean, the Austrians still managed to get there. Gentleman in the chat is pointing out that D&D players would love trench raids because it's a dungeon crawl, and
absolutely, yeah. You could quite easily go up and down, but that's one of the main ways you said that with wargaming is the way that it's tackled is trench raids and that higher level of battalion and up. And the apart from, say, Mud and Blood and Trench Hammer, there isn't a great deal in between, I would have said, because people just have this blind spot for that level of tactical.
Yeah, and that's, I think, is a pity because, like I said, with you get stuff like the platoon organizations and stuff, and that's really where it gets like interesting. Like, yeah. At some point, and again, I'm not like trying to bag on people who play like really high level games, but like, to me, like playing a World War I like regimental, like each stand is a regiment or whatever, that doesn't feel that different to doing it in the American Civil War or Waterloo. No. Like, they're just tokens moving around at some point, which is fine. Like, but that's not really, you don't get that much impression of, unless you make it like a logistics game, and nobody wants to like count shells.
I've been thinking about this recently, about a game based around logistics, nothing to do with the fighting on the front.
right. Like
where you can push forward your we all know, no army fights without the logistic core.
Yeah,
it's there, and I'm just
a harrowing simulation of being a train conductor in northern France in 1916. I mean, it's totally true.
To the front, yeah, that'd be brilliant.
Right, you gotta make sure that
I played a game, a First World War game called Wings for the Baron, which was developing aircraft in Germany between 1960.
Oh, that sounds really cool.
Yeah, there was a lot of maths involved in it, so it wasn't as cool as it sounds. But the concept was brilliant. But it was about developing aircraft. It was nothing to do with them fighting. It was just how good can you get them when they get to the front line.
Right. But yeah, like if you want to really like have that tactical thing, which is exactly what people say, is often missing. I think that kind of middle level, because again, like once you're all the way down to like the man to man, like one dude with a revolver is not any different in 1916 than it is in 1944. It's just a dude with a revolver.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Like you could use a World War II set of like skirmish rules and just change the name, as it really wouldn't matter. Like
I do. I mean, I played Chain of Command, First World War.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
And it works perfectly well.
Yeah, like we experimented a little bit with using what's it called, Face of Battle, which is a World War II skirmish game, and it just fine for doing some like 1918 stuff. But yeah, I think you need to zoom up a little bit so you get like that like platoon to company level. And it's also easier to find, in my opinion at least, it's easier to find things like tactical manuals and field manuals and stuff for some of that stuff. Because like a lot of times, like regimental manuals and stuff that's a whole different like beast. You know, that's ends up being a lot of bean counting and how many bayonets we need to do this or whatever.
Paddy Griffiths' book, British Infantry Tactics 1916 to 1918, is excellent for that kind of thing. I don't know if you're aware of it. It's quite old, but obviously Paddy Griffiths was a fantastic military historian anyway. And I think that it's basically what a lot of Through the Mud and Blood is based on. Through the Laddies, because they knew him anyway when he was alive, and it's a terrific book. I used it a lot in my master's degree for various essays that I was writing. It's well worth checking out a copy of that if you can get hold of it, because that just talks a lot about the platoon and the structure, and you know, it's that bottom level. When the platoon it goes from battalion command down to platoon command, you know, they're given more leeway on the battlefield to make decisions. Right. 1916 onwards, which is, you know, what we get today. Really, it's the formation of modern day tactics, tactics at least.
But it's also where it becomes, you know, just more gameable in some ways, because you're not necessarily bound into, you know, what's the word? Like written orders and stuff. And I don't have anything against written orders in games, but there is a feeling of being like stodgy, you know, like you set up your plan and it unfolds. It's like playing Spearhead, where one of the complaints made against it is that you create your plan, you draw it all out, and then the game kind of plays itself, which isn't completely fair. But I definitely like see where that kind of comes from. So being at a level where, you know, individual lieutenants or captains were expected to make personal decisions on like kind of moment to moment things at a level where you could react, you know, you can shout to the lieutenant leading like third platoon and have something happen in real time, as opposed to the wire is cut and we have to send a runner and it takes an hour to get them to move 3 inches on the tabletop. There's a question in the chat.
Yeah, I'm just going to bring that one up. Do you reckon that the lack of cavalry in First World War is what made war games scoff at playing the period?
For the World War II gamers, no. For the Napoleonic gamers, yes. They like their horses.
They do. But even so, I mean, cavalry played a massive role in the First World War. A friend of mine, Dave Kenyon, wrote a book, Horsemen of No Man's Land, looking at the role of cavalry in the First World War. It's based on his PhD dissertation. And, you know, even on the Somme, there was fighting in High Wood with cavalry charges. By 1918, the Canadian cavalry were still charging as well, up at a name will come to me, it's on the tip of my tongue. I excavated some of the trenches up there during the German advance in spring of 18. The thing with the cavalry in the First World War is, again, it's another misconception that they did cavalry charges all the time. They did some, but they didn't. They from the off, the British cavalry in particular were mobile infantry. That's what they were. That's what they were used as. That's how they fought. You know, they rode forward, they dismounted, they fought as infantry, remounted, and buggered off. You know, so you could quite easily use cavalry in the First World War, especially in the latter part of it,
and of course
in the early part of it as well. You know.
So and of course, on the Eastern Front, you get, you know, quite large cavalry formations fighting, and there's battles in the Russian Civil War where you have, you know, like regimental level, like cavalry movements happening on the battlefield in a way that seems surprising. It's actually kind of an interesting thing, because in a lot of game rules, you actually have to kind of mess with it a bit to avoid them being shot to pieces in a way that's ahistorical. Because they were able to operate. It could be for any number of reasons, poor supply or poor quality of, you know, musketry or whatever. But
Minotaurium also said there, he said this I'm not really sure what he means by this. He said he's struck that in all of the conflicts is the rock, paper, scissor aspect to warfare that's lacking in the First World War.
I think what it means is probably like Napoleonic. You have like infantry, cavalry, artillery.
Yeah.
Eventually, like the tank takes the place of the cavalry. I think there might be something to that, because I think a lot of times people also kind of dismiss it on the idea like, okay, all I get to paint is like a whole bunch of infantry that all look the same, like and it's not all that exciting because the artillery is well behind the line and the tanks are behind the line because that's where the engine gave out, and the airplanes are up there doing the fun stuff. So I think can definitely be a impression that it's kind of dull looking armies. But I think you have to, that's an area where I wonder if coming at it almost from a World War II perspective, because you still there's lots of stuff happening among those dull looking grunts in the mud. They have to, they're machine guns and trench mortars, and you get like weird little like direct fire, like field guns that gets pulled into the trenches. I know like gamers get too excited about stuff like submachine guns and shotguns and all that stuff, but like that stuff is there and you can throw it in there. To lighten things up a little. Like there's still things you can do, or you can grab, like I've been meaning to get an Indian battalion done just because they would look really cool. Especially
I've got one for square bashing.
Especially for French and British, you can grab like all kinds of stuff from all around and do them.
You've got all the colonial troops and everything, really, haven't you?
Yeah, and you have options like that for others as well. So I think, but it's one of those things that's not so immediately obvious, right? Like at the surface, when you look at photographs and stuff, it's a bunch of dudes, infantry with rifles sitting in trenches, because a lot of that stuff is hard to find, like documentation for, or if you read, like common history books, you'll find like one photo of like some Indian dudes, and then it's just like, London lads the whole rest of the time.
Gordon Corrigan, Sepoys in the Trenches. There you go. There's a book on the Indians.
Nice.
And there's another one as well. I can't remember. The name of the author escapes me, but I bought it. It came out quite recently, and it was about the Indians on the trenches in 1915. So there you go.
I'll have to track that down because
yes. Gordon Corrigan also wrote Mudblood and Poppycock, which is well worth reading. It's very bombastic. His defense of his tearing apart of the old 1960s. It's well worth reading because there's quite a lot of interesting stuff in there. There's things like the statistics he goes into, where he points out that actually more men died per day in the British Army, or more casualties were caused in the British Army per day, I think during the Normandy campaign than on the Somme, if you take the amount of casualties over the amount of time that the were fought. So it's quite eye-opening, and it's very similar to Forgotten Victory, which I know you were just reading recently.
Yeah, I'm currently reading through Peter Hart's, I think it's called like The Great War, A Combat History of the First World War. I might be getting the title wrong.
Everything by Peter Hart is great. Everything is well worth reading. He covers everything from the generals right down to the infantrymen in the trenches, and he's very well written. He's a very good historian.
Absolutely. What's interesting with him is he also kind of demolishes a couple of the myth. Like his section on the Battle of Mons is really interesting because he very much makes the point of like, the Mad Minute that gamers love probably didn't exist. Like the Germans probably didn't come on in columns until later on. So there's a
Fire and Movement.
Yeah.
Is that the name of the book?
I'm trying. Let me see if I can grab it without choking on the headphone cord here. The Great War, A Combat History of the First World War.
Okay, I don't know that one by him. But yeah, he's one 1914 called Fire and Movement. That's worth reading as well.
Oh yeah, that one's recommended on the back of it. So yeah, this one is kind of like a blow by blow of like each campaign and kind of going through with a lot of like quoting from different like memoirs and diaries and stuff like that. But it definitely takes a stab at some of the like mythology as well, which is interesting.
Yeah, he's very much of the revisionist school of thought, is old Peter. I know.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Friends of General Haig in the chat was suggesting looking at the Western Front as siege warfare, which I think is a really interesting thought.
Yes, it is, isn't it? I mean, certainly the middle part of it is a siege. It's a 3-year siege, basically. From 1915 really to the mid 1918, and basically the Allies in particular on the Western Front are just trying to learn how to break that siege, and this is where you get that development of tactics, and as we were talking about earlier, the scientific artillery developments, as well as the combined arms developments as well that you see later in the war, which also include tanks, all cooperating with infantry to various different extents, and useful.
Yeah, it was funny the other day. Me and the kid. My kid is 14. He likes to play miniatures occasionally, and we were reading through. I forget what rule book it was, but it had a section on indirect machine gun fire. And he was kind of laughing at it because the idea seemed silly to him, and I had to explain, like, no, this is really a thing. Here's how it worked. Yeah. But this is one of those like odd little pieces of complexity that like it's easy to miss unless you happen to stumble on it in some book, or like a rule book mentions it, and then you're like, okay, it's great, this rule is here, but I don't know what this means. So you have to like track it down, and that's always gonna be the problem unless you're churning out like a 300-page book.
Well, this is the thing, isn't it? I mean, like you mentioned in Through the Mud and the Blood, they go into the different tactics of the different armies, which is great, and I think that's an older thing of the older Lardy games, because I'm reading Bag the Hun at the moment, and there's about 4 or 5 pages on the different tactical uses of aircraft by different units, and it's something I don't think they do anymore, which is a bit of a shame, really. I mean, they touch on it in some of the later rules, but
I don't think Chain of Command had anything.
You are supposed to know this stuff, kind of thing. I'm not singling the Lardies out for that. I mean, like we said, a lot of war games writers do it, and it's down to space, isn't it?
Yeah, it's space, and it's like if 90% of your audience already knows the stuff, then are you just like cluttering up pages? So I get why it doesn't happen. Like I don't do it either, even though I know I should. But that's the thing. It's like when Flames of War was blowing up, and everyone got mad at them because the popular thing is bad. But the reason that it got so popular was because you could go there and get a book that said, here's what a company is, here's what this thing means, here's like if you knew nothing, you could sit down and get a grip on like what World War II gaming kind of sort of is, and then you could move on or not. Like I've never minded the game, it just wasn't my thing specifically.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I got a copy of the box set recently because I'm a Caesar Award winner. That was my pride. Got to drop that in there.
Yeah.
I've already got branded up, so I should be wearing everything else. I got the box set, and I have no interest in Flames of War. I mean, if that's what you like playing, then that's grand. I'll use figures for something else. But I was looking at the rules because the rules are in there, and the thing that struck me was that there are several pages in there of history of some of the major operations of the war. And it is, and Andrew just said there, Flames of War did the Games Workshop model for World War II, and yet it is
exactly.
They got it right. That's their business model, and if you want to buy into that, then happy days. Nobody's making you part with your money. But like you say, I think you could sit down as somebody who knows nothing about the Second World War and read through that, and you would come out with some knowledge, whether it's perfect historical scholarly knowledge or not is a different matter.
Absolutely. But the difference is that you're now sitting and playing a game.
Yeah.
And now you have the like hook in that lets you like go further. Like the best example, honestly, is Napoleonics, which I think I mentioned earlier. It took me forever because it was really Like learning anything about Napoleonic warfare from Napoleonic rulebooks is impossible because they're full of terminology that is not that difficult, but it's one of those things. If you see 3 terms on a page you don't know, you can go look them up. But if you see 20, it just becomes overwhelming.
It does, yeah.
And what really let me crack it in a way that made sense to me was, and I'm going to get his name wrong, but there's a guy, Philip Haythornthwaite.
Yes.
He's written, I think, at last count, 8 billion books on the Napoleonic Wars. He also wrote the really fantastic World War I and Napoleonic Wars source books, which are fantastic.
That's right, yeah.
But he had one, it's a pair, one called Napoleonic Infantry and one called Napoleonic Cavalry, I think. And they just broke down, here's what it works, here's what a line is, here's a column. With examples and diary stuff, and it just laid it out, all of it, so you could visualize it. And oh my god, I get it now. Now I can go figure out all the rest because you have a hook into it and you have a point starting from. Nobody likes to feel stupid, And especially for Napoleonics, the internet community can be excitable sometimes. There are a lot of dudes who've been doing it since the 70s, and 50 years later they don't need some young shit to come in and question how they do it. And here's read these 3 books in German. Cool. But at the same time, World War I will always suffer from the fact that it is really small. There's not that much of a audience for a game, so it's hard to recruit people into it,
Yeah, like you said, I say he's lacking that good historical background. But again, the problem is with the First World War is that the general books that are picked up by people who don't know anything about it are the books that are the bad history. I mean, I went to the Ypres bookshop, which is right next to the Menin Gate in Ypres, several years ago. I mean, I've been to Ypres quite a lot of times, and one of the last times I was in there, I was just looking around, and I couldn't see a single book by Gary Sheffield, as I say, only a First World War historian in Britain at the moment. But there was, piles of The Donkeys by Alan Clark. There was British Butchers, Bunglers of the First World War by John Laffin, and these things are just, they're just nonsense books, and they've been debunked for decades now, but they're still selling by the ton, and this is the problem. With very, very few people are looking at it, in any new scholarly light, and from a wargaming point of view as well. That's what I mean. It's at least with Napoleonics, there's so much out there that there are lots of introductory books which are pretty good, and the same with the Second World War, whereas the First World War there just isn't.
Well, and I think part of it too is the sort of very limited presence in media. If you want to play Bolt Action or 5 Minute Normandy, and all you got is a DVD set of Band of Brothers. You can put that on, you can watch some of the fights there, and you can make those happen on the tabletop.
Yeah,
and again, it doesn't specifically matter if that's accurate. That doesn't matter. What matters is that you have something you can start with, and you can sit down with your toys and miniatures, and you can get a game that feels like World War II. But the First World War doesn't really have it's hard to find a movie set during the First World War period, let alone one that actually shows anything like combat. And I mean, there's there was that Canadian Passchendaele, which had a pretty good trench fight scene at the end, even though it's mostly a hand-to-hand fight. But there's a couple, I really liked 1917, but it's not really a combat movie, so it's much harder to get that sort of, just the
sense of it, isn't it? I guess.
Yeah, being able to visualize it. You can watch Band of Brothers and watch one of the battles there, and you will immediately have some sort of idea of what things look like, and you have to translate that to your gaming table. What am I buying? What kind of terrain do I need? Do I just have a flat thing of mud and then I put up my dudes? That's not how it worked, but it's hard to get that sort of.
And I think with the media and with films and stuff, the ones I generally try not to watch First World War films just because there's so many holes in them. Really, from a point of view, I watched 1917 because a friend was a military advisor on it, and also I was just interested in it as well, really. But I didn't go into it thinking, oh, this is going to be a film about the First World War. It's a film set in the First World War that is a journey, it's basically it's Saving Private Ryan or Kelly's Heroes. They're going behind enemy lines to go somewhere specific to do something specific.
Right, and then with some interesting like camera work and stuff. Like it's a very visually impressive movie.
As a film, I thought it was excellent, and there was some really beautiful shots in it. But as a piece of history of the First World War, it's it's entertainment. It's not
exactly
not a documentary at all. And the thing that really annoys me, and my wife would attest to this, is tropes of the First World War. Every film it's always pissing it down with rain, and everybody's all the time, and up to their knees in the mud, and it's like, well, half of the. I know it's France and it's northern France, but there are days when it's really nice and warm, and it's and it wasn't raining all the time.
It's funny actually because I was talking to a friend of mine about World War I movies specifically, and I was kind of bemoaning that there weren't very many, and he was saying like, well, like nobody would want to watch that in a movie, and I was like, well, no, you could do, and I listed off 1,000 things you could do that would be really cool. And he made the point, like, that's great, but if you put all that in the movie, people aren't going to associate it with World War One.
That's it. It's again, it goes back to tropes, doesn't it? I mean, they certain things are put into certain films because that's what people expect of them.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's like any World War II movie, or especially any Vietnam movie. You'll have the one character who takes the photo of his girlfriend. He's going to get killed.
Exactly. Yeah. Get back, we're going to buy a farm together.
Right. Like
straight through the head. Put that picture down.
Right. Like every movie that has an American squad in World War II, there'll be like one Italian guy from Brooklyn because you got to have that dude. It just becomes like institutionalized. So. Absolutely. But I think,
but that's it. I mean, at the end of the day, they're not documentaries, are they? They're entertainment, And,
right. But yeah, so it is just one of those things, like where it's hard to, because, like I said, with the World War II stuff, there's so many angles people can come into it. And I think for World War One, it's just like it's more narrow. Like a lot of people, if you grew up, my generation, or definitely like a generation behind that, somebody was in World War II. They had a story, even if they just drove a truck or was an ammunition worker, whatever. So there's a personal connection to it. And that's like more difficult to find. Or, you just you play video games, you play Medal of Honor, and like, oh, wouldn't it be fun to play Warhammer, but with these guys? And you find out that's totally a thing. So I think that's like that's really like the gist of it, I guess. It's just much harder to get that like entry point for people, unless you just have like odd interests and you just find it fascinating. I wonder if with the 100-year anniversary and like the YouTube series and all that stuff, if any of that is going to have like a payoff effect, that there are going to be more people who are going to be interested and who are going to start kind of looking into it. Like it's always going to be, it's like, I guess the big three for historicals is like, Napoleon, like the American Civil War, and World War II, right? That's never going to change.
No.
But I think World War One could definitely, like it could grow. It's not like we're missing miniatures. Like there's a lot of stuff out there, across like multiple scales. And, there's not as many as like there's Imperial Romans or whatever, because everyone is puking those out. But, like we have the resources. We have an okay selection of games. Like it's there. It just kind of needs the spark, I think.
Yeah, I wonder how you do it, and I don't know myself, because it's one of the things I'm relatively passionate about is getting people to wargame the First World War, and when people do talk about the lack of tactics, as they say, and it's, you point out where that's incorrect, and use the history that I know of to point people in the right direction, and I obviously make videos on YouTube, and some of the things have been First World War ones. Have been specifically to show people that you can war game the First World War. It's not that difficult.
Yeah.
Put your preconceptions to one side and go for it. I mean, obviously, I'm not I'm not the guru of wargaming, but if at least somebody sees one of my videos and thinks I could do that as well, or I'll give.
I think that's a big part of it. Seeing it done and seeing, like, one, you can totally do this, and two, it looks fun.
Yeah.
I think that's an excellent way. And I think if you do, while I disagree that you have to do like Palestine and you have to do these other like side things that people usually go to. If that works as a way of getting people in, like, hey, no Lawrence Arabia, why don't we game that? Yeah. And then from there, you can kind of like inch your way into it. You find out like, oh, okay, like, well, if we're doing this, wouldn't it be cool to do something with like this cool tank I bought? And then like, all right, well, then you're gonna be stuck in the trenches. So let's figure out like how it works.
Yeah, how do you get out of them? How do you get into the German trenches?
Right, like it starts suggesting itself. So.
Well, look, Ivan, we're just hitting just after 2 hours here. I think we'll probably start to wrap it up here. I think.
Yeah, I think we've sort of
taken you away from whatever it is you're doing today for 2 hours.
Writing on an unnamed project. So,
okay. So yeah, you hear it here first, kids.
I guess.
One thing I was going to ask you was why the name Nordic Weasel?
So the Nordic part is just because I'm Danish, and it was just a thing. And Weasel dates back to, it's actually a reference to a character in a Warhammer 40k novel who went by the nickname of Weasel Fierce. And when I started getting on the internet, I needed a nickname, and I just picked Weasel, and it just stuck forever. So that's really all there is to it.
You can't get rid of it now, can you?
Yeah, I just kind of embraced it. So, weasels are like fun little critters that have a reputation for being kind of sly and up to stuff. So that fit me pretty well. But yeah, thanks for having me. Thanks for having me chat. I guess what I would leave out with is if I was going to do a game, how would 5-minute wipers sound for a title? That'd be pretty good, wouldn't it?
Perfect. I think absolutely perfect. Yeah, that was a great one. Yeah, that would be really good. And I would certainly buy it. And I think Bjorn also said he would buy it as well.
Yeah, so I think we're up to like 3 copies in chat.
There you go.
We'll get a Kickstarter going.
That's enough. That's enough, isn't it? 3.
But yeah, thanks so much for having me. That was
no problem. It's been excellent. It's really been interesting talk, and like I said, I'm very interested in how the background of your business model, and I'm always happy to talk First World War.
Absolutely. And thanks for everyone in the chat for hanging out and sharing.
Yeah, thank you everybody. So yeah, we'll wrap it up there, folks, and thank you very much. And we'll see you on the next one.
Yeah, absolutely. Have a great day. Bye.
Bye-bye.